Welcome to Orthodox Christian Theology. This is Craig Truglia, and with me right now is John Collorafi. How are we doing, John? Well, it's always great to have you on. I think you're more of a football fan than me. The Buffalo Bills got rid of Diggs. And it's literally an addition by subtraction move where really they have to hope and pray they get a wide receiver in the draft that's even half any good. And it kind of pigeonholes them because some teams might block them by picking a wide receiver before the Bills do. But the reality is it wasn't working for Diggs with us. So it's just sort of you just hope we could just make it to the playoffs and get lucky. It's kind of like our plan next year. The Bills have enough talent with Josh Allen where they'll make it to the playoffs, right? They'll do that much. They'll get a wild card or something. But they don't have the talent to make it much farther than that, which is disappointing. But as a Bills fan, I'm kind of used to futility. I mean, how has the offseason been for the Jets for you guys? Because I can't say I follow that too closely.
Surprise, the Jets won the game over the Bills by a great punt return for a touchdown in overtime. So both sides had a little bit, actually, you had a little bit to be unhappy about. We had an entire season to be unhappy about. So there you have it.
I mean, to be fair, the Giants have, even with Eli Manning, they did the Super Bowl. He obviously won Super Bowl 25 against the Bills. But the Jets, other than in the 60s, like you point out, really haven't been doing that much for a very long time. So it's, I don't know. I guess we have that in common. When I lived near the city before I moved upstate, the Bills have always been my team my whole life. But you know who my second team was? It was the Jets. So I never really had a real good team to root for when it comes to football.
All right.
So that being said,
go ahead.
So that being said, I don't think people are here to hear our views on football. So let's talk about what people really want to hear about the 1200 Years' War. So why did you call this the 1200 Years' War? And for a moment, I'm just going to real quick yell at my family here to be a little more quiet because I have you as a call-in on the phone, so everyone's going to hear everything. All right, so there we go. The audio is back live.
Okay. All right, so we're going to begin. For me, this began, although I was aware, I've read books about the Council of Florence, but this particular passage that's being disputed, although I was aware of it, it was definitely a side note, something I found in my head at best. And I never expected to be some kind of expert in the passage. What happened was, about 6 months ago, there was a debate between Militant Thomas, Christian Wagner, and David Erhan on Eunomium. There's tens of thousands saw that debate.
Oh yeah, 55,000 views right now.
There's many. How many?
55,000.
55,000 by now. Okay. So in the debate, Wagner used a disputed version of St. Basil's Contra Eunomium 3:1. From Book 3, Chapter 1. that is generally not accepted by scholarship as genuine.
Now, when you say generally, is there anyone at least that accepts it?
Out of 4 different Catholic editors that we're going to be talking about, now this is only on the Catholic side, out of 4 different Catholic editors we'll be talking about, only one accepted it as genuine, and that was almost 200 years ago.
Okay.
So,
but it's so, and for the sake of charity, I'm going to try to, give you opportunity to say something that might redeem Wagner in this. I mean, is believing it's authentic, before we get into the details, something that is justifiable in some level, or is it completely unjustifiable, in your view?
Well, we're going to get to all of that, but I just want to say first, I was just setting the background. By talking about Wagner and the debate, I was talking about the background to this controversy first. So that was what got me into it. So the first thing that happened, and by the way, just to give, I just want to say, to give hat tips all around, I thought both gentlemen were argued as gallantly as they could. Erhan challenged the quotation. He stood his ground. That night, Jay Dyer posted from a recent Catholic edition of the work from Catholic U, which said that the passage is not authentic. So I'm going to acknowledge the hat tips. Wagner defended himself by giving multiple uses of this passage by both Latins and Greeks from the Middle Ages and late Middle Ages. Okay, so acknowledging all of that as background, I got involved that night where I said, I want to study this passage, learn as much as I could, and try to come to some kind of, try to get to the bottom of it if possible. So that resulted in many months of work on my part. And so in this stream, what we're going to be doing is taking the history of that passage, which I can trace back at least 1,250 years. 1,250 years, the history of the passage, whatever we know about it, the history of the whole controversy and dispute, the use of this passage at Florence, and many other related things that are going to come up in this stream. Okay, so if you like a good story and you like theology and you're interested in the disputes of the Council of Florence, chances are you're going to like this stream. So get around and we're going to hear about the 1,200 Years' War.
So we're going to have a 30-second interruption before we unpack the 1,200 Years of War to see if we can fix the audio. So, John, please hang with us for the moment.
Sure.
What we're doing right now is see if we get a stronger connection. John is a call-in, and he always is. And so for that reason, its audio is not going to be like not a call-in. It's going to sound like a guy calling on the radio. So hang on, guys. All right, John, are you back? Hey, John, you there? We lost John. We're going to get John right back. Don't you worry. John. Hello. All right, we're gonna try calling John back. They got John back on the show. They'll unpack the 1,200 Years' War. So please tell your friends to tune in, because that's what we're about to get into. We just got to get John Collorafi back on the line. And audience, let me know if I'm coming in through nice and clear. All right. Dialing John. Supposedly. All right, we're going to just try refreshing the phone to make it work. We got a lot of interesting stuff to be unpacking, so well worth it, I feel, to get John on. People are like, oh, we want perfect audio. You want good content or not? Right? You want good content? Sometimes you got to deal with the technological issues. So we're getting John back on the line, so please be patient and dial in him as we speak. John is coming on. Hey, John, you're back on. So we're ready to unpack the 1200 Years' War. So begin where you like, and I'll interject where I think it's interesting.
Okay, great. So keep in mind, I'm going to be using, I have to go to my text while I'm on the phone, so I'll be using two different parts of the phone. I don't know if that's going to affect any, the connection or not, really, but I'm going to have to do that. So, okay, so our story today, as we said, is the 1200 Years' War, the long history of this passage, and the disputes about this passage. So we're going to start 600 years ago at the Council of Florence, when one of the orators, John of Montenero, early in the council, quoted St. Basil during the opening debate on the Filioque. And the quote, his quotation was from Contra Eunomium. It was against Eunomius, Book 3, Chapter 1. And the quote that he gave was like this. This is my translation. Even if the Spirit is third in dignity and order, what necessity is there that he be third also in nature? Perhaps the word of piety hands down that he is second after the Son, having being from him and receiving from him, and announcing to us and being entirely dependent on that cause, but that he must be third by nature, we have neither been taught by the Holy Scriptures, nor does it follow from the premises by logical necessity. So that was his quotation, his version of St. Basil. Now, what happens? Well, Mark of Ephesus objected to the passage as being basically an interpolated passage. Now, the words that are different in the text as defended by the Latins and defended by the Greeks are these words. This is the difference. Okay, and you're welcome to put up the screen.
And I have it on screen just so viewers are aware. There's a typo. On the left side is the version that was used by the Latin side in Florence, the arguably interpolated version. On the right side, it says interpolated version, but that's the version the Greeks, through St. Mark of Ephesus, or in John's view, Mark of Ephesus, used. So left is Latin side, right is Greek side. So by all means, John, it's up on screen.
Okay, so you've got the screenshots. So the difference is in these four phrases: having being from him and receiving from him, and announcing to us, and being entirely dependent on that cause, aitia in Greek. Okay, so you can see that the version from John of Montenero is a version that would certainly tend to support the Latin side on the Filioque. Certainly the words like having being from him, receiving from him, and then the word cause, being entirely dependent on that cause. Now, by the way, as a translator, just to show you my limits, I looked up the word for dependent, and I wasn't able to find it in my lexicon, because I wasn't able to figure out the stem of that particular verb. I think they have it as a participle here. So just to let you know, I'm not like some kind of, the world's biggest Greek expert. If anybody knows what the stem, if anybody knows this text in Greek and knows the verb, the stem of the verb, I'll be very pleased to be enlightened on that. Okay, but I'm certainly following the other translators here. We're going to see that. We're going to put it up. We can put up a screenshot in Greek later, but we will get to that part later. So those are the four phrases that are really in dispute: having being from him and receiving from him, and announcing to us, and being entirely dependent on that cause. And even in Greek, it's the word aitia, so that's the big word that was contested by the Greeks. Okay, I think everybody knows that much. So, as we said, Mark made the objection, and the Latin said, wait a minute. We have, these are all codices, as what the Latins call, what they're calling antiquissimi codices. And if the other Paul's listening, he's probably going to be cringing because I don't use the classical pronunciation. You say codices when you pronounce like that, it's the ecclesiastical type of pronunciation. So very cringy if you pronounce Latin classically. So
you pronounce it the right way.
It's ecclesiastical Latin.
There, Latin people still speak.
Whereas Greek is the opposite. I learned the Attic classical pronunciation. I don't know the modern pronunciation.
See, the only pronunciation I can even attempt is the modern pronunciation.
There you go. There you go. Okay. Just to give you our limits as linguists here. Okay, so Mark stood his ground, whereas the Latins also tried to stand their ground. They said, wait a minute, what's your problem here? We've got antiquissimi codices. These are very ancient codices that predate the schism. What's the problem? Well, what Mark said was, well, there may be 4 or 5 manuscripts like that in Constantinople, but there's up to 1,000 that have it the other way.
That doesn't sound like an exaggeration, right?
No comment. I'm going to stay on the factual part here.
Okay.
That's what we're doing. As we're trying to, yeah, right. So this is what we're doing. As by doing this examination, we're trying to get around the hyperbole and the hoopla and trying to get to the actual facts as far as we can. Okay. So the count, according to Father Joseph Gill, edited the Greek Acts of Florence, and I happen to have those acts, and some other work by Father Gill on Florence. Now, Father Gill says that when they did an examination of these manuscripts or codices, there were 5 at Florence that favored the Latin reading and 1 that favored the Greek side. So 5 to 1 at this point in Latin.
Now, were you a Seinfeld fan back in the day in the 90s, or not really?
I'm going to confess, I liked the show. I mean, I found the show funny, but
Too racist.
there are a lot of things, there are a lot of aspects in Jewish comedy that I don't like, so I have mixed feelings.
There was a Jewish joke in one of the episodes, right? And it's in reference to what you just mentioned. During Florence, right? They're not fools there. 5 of the codices at Florence have the version that Montanero's using. Only 1 didn't, right? The quote Jerry Seinfeld, that's an awfully big matzo ball. Right? So you know the joke. Right? It's an awfully big matzo ball hanging out of your nose, right? So
I actually remember that, yeah. There might be big matzo ball, right.
Right? Okay. So it really sticks out at that time. This would have not looked good for the Greek side.
Right. As I say, I was going to say, at this juncture, the Latins are doing very well in this debate. Now, there was another Greek prelate, very famous one, another giant as well, by the name John Bessarion, Metropolitan of Nicaea. Bessarion originally took the Greek side, but on the grounds that the Latins and Greek fathers had to have the same doctrine, he came over to the Latin side on the question of union. After the council, Bessarion went to Constantinople, and he decided to do a little gumshoe detective work himself and examine the manuscripts. And what he found is indeed that the older manuscripts, at that time, the older manuscripts either had the Latin reading or they had the Latin reading, but it was erased, scratched out, or otherwise erased.
That's another big matzo ball.
Yes. And whereas some of the newer manuscripts have the reading defended by the Greeks, and he describes all that in his letter to Alexius Lascaris. Okay,
now, and just to make clear, to clarify, would you say that the operating presumption during Florence was that the Latin and Greek fathers overall must reconcile with one another. That was the theological assumption both sides were working with. Is that correct?
Well, I would say that certainly the Latins would have supported the notion. I think both sides would have come in with the notion, the general idea that the Latin and Greek fathers must be teaching the same thing. As a general principle, I think they would have acknowledged that. The problem was a case like this one where you have a work where they're not even agreed on what the teaching was because of this dispute over the manuscript and things like that. And in many cases the Greeks were not familiar with the Latin fathers, so they were at a disadvantage. So generally speaking, I think both sides, Bessarion certainly supported the principle that both Latin and Greek fathers fundamentally had to be teaching the same doctrine. And for that reason, he went over to the Latins. Yes. And he did this investigation at Constantinople.
Very good.
So the interesting thing is that these eminent theologians at this great council of East and West are treating the question like it was like a completely new controversy. And this is not the case at all. The controversy is actually very old, and it was known at Constantinople, which is odd. But that is also the case, and I'm going to show that too. So let's take a few other Greek theologians who knew this passage and used it. So the first one is somebody named Manuel Kallikas, who was only about 40 years before the Council of Florence, so early in the 15th century. Manuel Kallikas was a Greek man who not only became a unionist, but he actually went over formally to the Latin side and joined the Dominican order. And in his writings, he uses this particular passage to defend the filioque doctrine. So that's Manuel Kallikas. That's early in the 15th century, but even before that, the passage was used. So we have to go back to the 13th century at the time of the Union of Lyon. And to give the context, of course, I believe the emperor was Michael VIII Palaeologos. I hope that's correct. I think it is. Mm-hmm. Michael VIII Palaeologos decided to unite with the Latins, and he needed to have a patriarch who would support this union. Now, he had a archivist, or in Greek, chartophylax. By the way, that's an example of a barbarous modern pronunciation. The word for archivist in the classical pronunciation would be something like cartaphylax. Okay, and I said chartophylax. I feel sort of like the way my French-Canadian mother would feel when she would hear the word Notre Dame. And of course, anybody raised in French Canada would know it's Notre Dame. So, chartophylax. So John Bekos was the chartophylax for the emperor. Basically, John Bekos at the time took the Greek side of this controversy. And the emperor wanted to change his mind. But what happened was he was thrown into prison because he said that he thought that the Latins were heretics. He thought that the Latins, his attitude is, we may not call them heretics, but they're heretics. In other words, out of politeness maybe, or for whatever reason, we don't call them heretics, but they're heretics. This was his original position. John Bekos was put in prison. Funny thing happened to John Bekos in prison. He decided to he's studying the fathers of the church. He'd been more secular. He's an educated man, but he'd been more secular in his education up to that time. He studied the fathers, and he decided that the Latin position was indeed correct, and that this state of separation was indefensible. He came over to the side of the Unionists, and he was made patriarch, and he was patriarch for 8 years, from 1275 to 1283. Now, course, everybody knows that the union was ended under the next emperor, Andronicus. Bekos was put in prison. He died in prison in 1297. Bekos had two archdeacons who supported him and wrote about this controversy, as did Bekos. Those two archdeacons were Constantine Melitiniates, who also died in prison, I think around the turn of the 14th century or a little after, and somebody named George Metochites, who also died in prison, and he was in prison for 45 years, from, I think, 1283 to around 1328, if I remember correctly. Now, all three wrote apologetical works to defend the Latin teaching on the Filioque. For example, John Bekos wrote a work called Epigraphs, where he not only uses this text, but it's one of the first texts that he uses. So it's not just that he's using the text, but he's using it right at the beginning, like first thing in the morning. Okay, so he knew about this text, and it was an important part of the arsenal. He also examined multiple manuscripts because he talks about some very minor differences in the manuscripts, without necessarily suspecting that this was a major difference. These four phrases that are disputed. So John Bekos believed that this was a legitimate reading of the text of Contra Eunomium. Both Constantine Melitiniates and George Metochites also wrote works on the procession of the Holy Spirit, where they used this text to defend the union and to defend the Latin teaching on the Filioque. Now, as an aside, a thing that I find moving about Bekos is that while the emperor was known for harshness and cruelty and persecution of his opponents, Bekos, although he had been in prison, was known for preaching mercy and pardon. He would frequently get audiences with the emperor to ask the emperor for pardons of people who were being imprisoned. There was one famous case, according to the chroniclers of that time, where the emperor didn't wish to give the pardon, and Bekos threw down his crozier in disgust and went away and retired to a monastery, and eventually even resigned the patriarch. And of course, that was a huge embarrassment. They had to bring him back. So basically, what this boils down to is that this controversy about the Filioque and the St. Basil passage should not have been new. It certainly should not have been new to the Greeks, because this question had already been raised and debated.
So
if they knew
so they kind of got caught with their pants down in a way. It's sort of like an obvious thing they should have been ready to debate, and they really weren't prepared.
Well, in my opinion, the Latins, not that the Latins, were performed the way I would like them to perform 100%, but certainly they were much more ready than the Greeks. Certainly for something like this, the Greeks should have been ready for that. Now, Mark of Ephesus was somewhat ready for the controversy. I mean, he contested it, but you can see that this should have been something. I mean, if this were like one of these modern debates like they have today, this would be the first thing you should be expecting.
So so Mark of Ephesus needed J. Dyer to bring up the Catholic University of America Press version in Florence.
Well, he certainly knew that this is a passage he's going to contest, so I will give him that.
Yeah.
Okay, now there's one other writer, but this is the Latin writer in the mid-12th century, and this writer, sometimes known in Latin as Hugo Atarianus. Atarianus was an official, although he's Latin, he was an official in the court under the Comnenus dynasty, and he also used this passage, but he's not one of the Greeks per se, he's more on the Latin side, but he also used the passage, meaning the passage was known, and they said, now we've gone back to the mid-12th century, so we're already back almost 900 years with this controversy.
Yeah.
Okay.
Let's make our way 1,200 years.
All right. So that's the first side that we're looking at. Now, the next thing we need to look at is what have Catholic editors done with this passage? What have they thought of it? Well, there have been multiple Catholic editions of this work. I mean, outside the Catholic Church, I take it for granted that nobody's going to accept the validity of this passage, the disputed part. But first, the first editor of this passage on the Catholic side in modern times was somebody named Dom Julien Garnier, Benedictine. And like many other Benedictines, he edited works of the Fathers of the Church. Dom Garnier, about 300 years ago, he was working with basically French or Paris manuscripts, and he rejected the authenticity of the disputed passage. So he sided with the Greeks on the particular passage in dispute. Now, there was another editor that came along, I believe also Benedictine, named Dom Prudentius Morin, who took the other side. So Dom Morin decided to include this in the text, that is the disputed part, the part defended by the Latins. And it was Dom Morin who was followed by J.P. Migne. Okay, so that's the second major editorial judgment. The third, and this is by far the most important one, the modern critical edition of this work is about 4 decades old, 40 years old, from the early 80s. It was done by Source Chrétien.
Now, in the early 80s, were dinosaurs roaming the earth? Because a lot of these viewers, they didn't know this, but most people didn't have computers back then. They didn't have phones with screens. How did people used to read back then, John?
I don't know, but you know what? They did. I mean, you had Source Chrétien has been around for a long time. What they do is, it's sort of like, I hesitate to say a French version of Migne, but it's a much more sophisticated version of the Fathers than what you had before that. So what they do is they take different works by the Fathers and publish a critical text, critical edition, notes, introduction, some commentary, original language, French translation, all the good stuff. And these are real scholars. These are the ones who know what they're doing. They're the pros. Now, I got to tell you, I mean, I'm not necessarily going to vouch for the theology because there's a lot of problems with modernism in the French church. And some of it started with the patristic scholars. So I'm not going to defend the theology side.
So you're critical of these people to begin with, but you will still account for their arguments and their evidence.
Well, yes. In other words, do they know what they're talking about? The answer is yes. You can be a modernist and know what you're talking about when in terms of scholarship, texts, variants, what's authentic, what's not, all that kind of stuff. So, and I'm not accusing any of them of modernism. I'm just saying that that's something. I mean, I'm a traditionalist. I keep that in the back of my mind. We're supposed to see heresy, 10 miles away, whether it's there or not. Okay, so think of us traditionalists sort of the way you think of like the Rocor, we're the extreme traditionalists that ride herd on the regular tradition. Okay, so all right, so Source Chrétien did a critical edition of the Contra Eunomium. Now, this is where we need to get into. I want to say first. Number one, short answer is that they rejected the passage that was defended by the Latins. That's the short answer. And there were 3 editors. Two of them were Jesuits, Father Bernard Sesboué, Father Louis Dutrelot, and then a third one, Dominican priest by the name of Georges Mathieu de Duras. And they did, for their critical edition, they studied at least 20 manuscripts, which they show in the book. They give a letter of the alphabet, symbolize each one. All right. Now, my conclusion would have been, look, if you're arguing with a critical edition, that's like arguing with the umpire calling balls and strikes. I mean, this just doesn't typically end well. It's just not something you want to do. You can't really argue with the critical edition. I mean, these are the guys who know what they're doing. They know everything about it. So that would be my answer. But even if we want to get down to specifics, first of all, of the 20 manuscripts, 2 of them were Syriac. And maybe we can get the screenshot. We're going to get a screenshot from somebody using the handle Maximo Legia, who replied to Wagner's arguments. So Maximo Legia, in his number 12 of his arguments, response to Wagner, is giving you a screenshot of the manuscripts that were used in this critical edition. Okay, so do you have up number 12?
I have it up.
Okay, great. So look what we got here. They got 20 different manuscripts, and on the bottom it says SEER, Muse, in other words, British Museum, ADD, additional 14635, 17145. That's 2 different manuscripts. So these 2 Syriac manuscripts do not have the additional words that the Latins were supporting. And these are very old manuscripts, dated from between the 8th and 9th centuries. Now, that's what I would have said. I would have said, okay, look, the critical edition doesn't support this disputed reading, and the Syriac manuscripts, are among the oldest, don't have this disputed reading. I mean, hey, at some point we got to give it up. All right, but this gentleman using the handle Maximo Legia went a little further. He actually argued a little more forcefully than I would have. So I want to see if I can find him. Can we show what he has for number 11? And number 10 and number 11. He actually he gives you a screenshot of the text and translation, and you can see the critical apparatus. So do we have that up?
Not easily, John. How about you explain, and I'll see what I can do.
Okay. If we get Maximo Legia and his response to Wagner's screenshot of 10 and 11, he's going to show, first of all, the text, the screenshot of the actual text in Greek, then the translation, and then in number 11...
Right. I have it there, just so people know, it's the image in the bottom right of the screen.
Okay. So in number 11, he even gives you like a zoom in on the 5 manuscripts that have the disputed reading. So he's saying, okay, yeah, 5 manuscripts have the disputed reading, and they have letters.
And just to make clear to people, manuscript families, right? Like we were hearing during Florence, how they were finding 5, they had 5 that were there that had it, and then they have found more in Constantinople, et cetera, et cetera. What the textual critical scholars do is they actually find not just manuscripts themselves, but they find physical versions that still exist, and they figure out what family they belong to. There's a total of 4 families, and there's 5 that belong to the family that was used during Florence.
Right. So he's going into more detail than I would have, but fine. Okay, so he's showing 5 manuscripts have the disputed reading, 5 out of 20. Now, that doesn't mean that there's only 5 manuscripts that have the disputed reading. I already showed you there are many more than that, just from our anecdotes. There were 5 in Florence. Cardinal Bessarion found more. John Beckros had multiple manuscripts.
We lost 1,000 without it, allegedly. We only have 20 total today, so okay. Yep, we got it.
Right. I'm just we're trying to get to the facts here as far as we can, avoid a little hyperbole on either side.
Exactly.
So we got 5. Okay, then Maximo Legia, going on to number 12 of his response to Wagner, he actually gives the specifics about the 5 manuscripts. We have that, number 12. Okay, now, very important. I mean, this is the crusher to me. Number 13, he gives a diagram of the manuscript family or family tree. And you can see that from his diagram, the manuscripts that have the disputed reading are kind of towards the bottom. They're the younger manuscripts, or the more recent as opposed to the older manuscripts.
And that's on screen. And so just so people are aware, let me just read out what's here so people can see what we're dealing with. There's 4 families. We could see that, let me just, on my side, make it bigger so I could see it easier. We could see the Syriac version is the second family, and it's dated to the 6th century. Then there is a family number 1, which earliest versions are from the 9th century. Then we have family number 3, which Alexakis locates to the 8th century and perhaps even the 7th. But our earliest extant versions today are the 9th and 10th centuries, and which are the earliest, Marcianus Fondo Antico and Lavra B105. All right, so those are dated to the 9th, 10th centuries. Alexakis actually dates Marcianus Fondo Antico to the early 9th century. I think it's like footnote 32 in one of his articles, if I remember right. So people are aware, they're still pretty early, and just not as early as Syriac. And then we have a 4th manuscript family, so you see all the way to the right. What is the relevance of this? And John, you can interject, you got more to add, but I'll just say this simply, is we can discern the families because they'll have certain commonalities. And so if several manuscripts have these commonalities, you can find out, then they came from an original source. And so that's why we can group them together. And then the earliest of that source becomes at least proof of the earliest rendering that all of them share in common, right? And we have that with these. But from what I could tell, it's really the Syriac that proves decisive in one way. And the fact that there's additional manuscript families in the Greek that are totally different from one another, that they would independently corroborate one another. But I will get into this, and we might actually debate. I do think, though, the jury would not be out for manuscript family 3, which is the family that was favored during Florence. So I will stop my comments there, and John, it's on screen, so by all means continue.
Okay, the only continuation I have is basically, I can just read out what Maximo Legius says to Wagner, 15, 16, 17, and 18. So if we get 15, 16, 17, and 18 up.
Might not be able to get those up so quick, but please, by all means.
Okay, you can get them up. I'll just read what he says. So, Maximo Legius says this. Number 15, textually, there are 4 different families of manuscripts. DG, the Syriac translations, AELMNO, and then 4th is BCFKRVXZ. And he says, Militant Thomas' clause about the Son being cause of the Spirit is entirely absent from 3 of these 4 families. Then, number 16, especially noteworthy is the total absence of Militant Thomas' clause from the Syriac manuscripts, which predate the surviving Greek manuscripts by several centuries. That's what I would have said. I would have said that, but you notice Maximo Legius has a much more detailed argument than I would have made, to be honest. That's why we're screenshotting it. 17. When 3 of the 4 major manuscript families of a text lack a particular clause, then the obvious conclusion is that this clause is not authentic to the original work, but that it originated. He trails off there. Is not authentic to the original work. 18. With this array of evidence, it is not plausible to view Militant Thomas' clause as original. Rather, it seems clear that this clause originated with the origin of the manuscript family AELMNO, which the philological evidence dates to the 8th century at the earliest. Okay, so that's his argument. So, just to be fair, the editors of the critical edition do admit that this disputed reading, while it's not part of the text, it is a very old reading. They didn't necessarily think that it was due to fraudulent manipulations, and it was in more than one manuscript group. And like I said, there were certainly, clearly during the late Middle Ages, there were multiple manuscripts with this disputed reading. But the bottom line is that the editors rejected the disputed reading, and they went for the reading supported by the Greeks rather than that of the Latins. So, there we have it. That was another major part of this presentation. Now, it's interesting that in number 18, Maximo Legia is saying that the philological evidence dates to the 8th century at the earliest. So his argument is that if 3 out of the 4 manuscript families do not have the disputed clause, and the one that does is a later manuscript family. That's the basic argument, as well as the Syriac version not having the disputed clause, and that's a very old version, which would have come from much older manuscripts. So that's his argument. Okay, so then he talks about number 18, philological evidence dating the disputed clause at best to the 8th century, according to Maximo Legia. Okay, so there's one other edition done by the Catholics. That was done by Catholic University about 10 years ago, but that's not a critical edition. It does not advance the scholarship substantially in any way as far as I can tell, so we don't need to really talk about that too much. Although they did have a footnote, which is relevant. Okay, and the footnote is, and I'm going to have to go to ask for another screenshot here.
I believe I have it on screen about Eunomius being quoted.
Right, exactly. So let me just get to I have to go to my own.
So John is referencing right now the passage, the disputed passage between the Latin side and Greek side in Florence. And apparently the disputed passage may actually be an accurate quote of Eunomius, which would be consistent with the sort of point being made in the passage overall. So do you have it handy now, John?
I do. Okay.
Okay.
So here's what I have. Okay. The disputed passage is this: having being from him, and then here are the words that scholars say are from Eunomius: receiving from him and announcing to us, and the quote from Eunomius, and then and being entirely dependent on that cause. Okay, so we intended to have a screenshot for that.
Yep,
so
what's up?
within the disputed passage, we have 2 of the 4 phrases have been found to be from Eunomius. And once again, okay, receiving from him and announcing to us. Those are the 2 phrases which scholars are now saying are from Eunomius. So let me read the passage again. Having being from him, and here's from Eunomius, receiving from him and announcing to us, now back to the rest, and being entirely dependent on that cause. So 2 of the 4 disputed phrases have been found by scholars to be from Eunomius.
Now, in which, this is where, and I know you're going to unpack Alexakis, and you're pretty convinced of Alexakis' argumentation, and it's important argumentation, but let me say this to be critical, right? We're talking text criticism. The fact that Eunomius is being quoted in reference to a passage which is on purpose entertaining Eunomius' ideas for the sake of debunking them. I mean, that's what Basil's doing here. Would speak to either something that Basil would authentically actually quote, right? Why wouldn't you quote Eunomius to refute him? Or a later, but not much later scribe, in perhaps what was originally a footnote or a scholia, quoting what was being debunked from Eunomius, right? It's a very authentic touch. And so either way, like you said, this interpolation almost makes it sound like a too negative of a connotation. It's a passage whose insertion, whether original or interpolated, would have made sense for the overall argument being made. But let me stop there and leave it back to you to make comment or to continue.
Right. Okay. So that is okay. Let me just read the passage as defended by the Greeks.
All right, I'm going to put that on screen.
So the passage the passage that was defended by the Greeks, in that passage, the argument is this: even if the Spirit is third in dignity and order, in other words, even if we allow that argument, even if the Spirit is third in dignity and order, what necessity is there that he be third also in nature? So that's the first thing. Even if we allow this, that the Spirit is third in dignity and order, does that mean he's third in nature? That's the argument. Then again, same argument. Perhaps, in other words, even if the word of piety, perhaps the word of piety, hands down that he is second after the Son, but that he must be third by nature, we have neither been taught by the Holy Scripture, nor does it follow from the premises by logical necessity. In other words, even if we allow this premise, the Spirit's still not necessarily third in nature. Okay, that's the basic argument. We haven't been taught this by the Scripture. It doesn't follow from logical necessity. That's the basic argument. Now, if you look at the disputed passage, it's interrupting that argument. The argument is that even if the Spirit is third in order or dignity, he's not third in nature. Okay? The disputed passage interrupts this argument and turns it into some kind of argument implicitly for the filioque, having being from him and receiving from him and announcing to us.
Well, John, let me interrupt, because maybe I'm confusing between the Latin and Greek, but when I read, and not the Latin, but the Latin side, it's translated Greek, where I show that the Latin rendering is, from the Latin side, this is a translation of the Greek, perhaps the word of piety, hands down that he is second after the Son, having being from him and receiving from him and announcing to us and being entirely dependent on the cause. But then it continues just like what the Greek side said, but that he must be third by nature. We have neither been taught by Holy Scriptures, nor does it follow from the premises by logical necessity. Are you saying that that whole part about logical necessity is missing from the Latin side?
No, I'm not saying it's missing. What I'm saying is that the four phrases that the Greeks thought were an interpolation are interrupting the main argument. In other words, the argument...
Yes, okay, I see what you're saying.
The authentic passage is that even if the Spirit is third in dignity and order, does that mean he's third in nature? That's the basic argument.
Yeah.
And that's the whole argument.
Now,
that's the point.
If I could defend either this being original or a early scribe adding this as a scholia, i.e. footnote of some sort, the allegedly interpolated section, which on screen is in bold and in parentheses to the left, all it does is clarify what Basil is responding to from Eunomius, because whether you pick the Latin side or the Greek side of Florence, their respective versions against Eunomius, it still ends with, essentially, but that he must be third by nature. We have neither been taught by Holy Scriptures, nor does it follow from the premises by logical necessity. And so, in either event, the Basil and bold versions is really not endorsing what's in the parentheses that we find in the version used by the Latin side. Now, you would maybe have to have recourse to the Greek itself. I can only read in translation. Father Van Sickle, who wrote an article about the debate over this passage, did add something that he claims, and I could put the Greek on screen for people that want to see it. John can't, so you'd have to look at it, I guess, look at his actual Greek version in front of him. But where it says, likewise, it is clear that even if the Holy Spirit is below the Son in rank and dignity, Van Sickle adds, let us make this supposition, it is still not likely, right? So essentially, what Basil's saying, for the sake of argument, let us accept this. But, right, he doesn't actually concede the point. This is something that Van Sickle's translation points out. And so it seems to me that the eternal logic of the passage actually works with the interpolated section if we understand it to be Basil entertaining suppositions, not endorsing the suppositions. This is something that ironically the Greek side's version actually makes clear, but you can still infer it from the Greek of the Latin side from Florence. And so I have this on screen for people to see. If I'll give you an opportunity to respond, John, and I'll put the Greek on screen for the audience. As for, I don't know if you have it there or if you'll have to look at it later. So let me get that ready, and I'll let you respond as I get the Greek on screen.
Okay. So just one more time, my view is this. Okay, first of all, I tend to believe that the disputed version could have been a Scholian. There are two phrases, as you say, that are believed to be from Eunomius. Two other phrases that support the Latin teaching on the filioque by talking about the Spirit as being dependent on the Son as a cause, a receiving being from the Son. Okay. Okay, we got Latin text, Greek text. Okay.
You actually see it, John? You see what I got?
Yeah, I'm trying to see all these different things at one time. I'm getting overloaded myself.
Yeah, John's probably seen four phones as we speak.
Right. My view is that the four disputed phrases are interrupting the argument by changing it to an argument about the filioque, or the Spirit being either dependent on the Son as cause or receiving being from him in that vein. Whereas the original argument in the undisputed passage is basically saying that even if the Spirit is somehow third in order or dignity, it doesn't mean that he's third in nature. All right, so I'm saying the text defended by the Latins is changing the subject by putting in these four phrases that are basically related to the filioque.
Yeah, I'm definitely not an expert in this passage, so I'm completely open to correction, but I can't help but feel that if this was originally some sort of scholia, like you acknowledge, this is a good possibility, or even if it was original, if the whole parenthetical statement was intended to be an encapsulation of Eunomius's views, right? So even if it's pro filioque, it's intended to be the encapsulation of Eunomius, right? So it's not necessarily an endorsement. Then it really wouldn't be an argument that interrupts the overall argument of the passage, right? That only comes out that way if we think Basil's whole purpose was the way in on the eternal causation of the Holy Spirit. If that really isn't the thrust of the passage, I think it's possible to read the passage as Basil making a point, entertaining something Eunomius said, and then refuting it, and with which to me actually implies a rejection of the of that filioque view, even if it were a original to the passage. It's like I said, if it's a scholia at least, that makes it less refutation and more of the scribe pointing out, this was the overall stuff that, in my view, Basil was responding to. If not, this does happen, by the way. There are, like, in the Ambigua written by St. Maximus, sometimes they add, questions Thalassius, actually. Sometimes the same saint rewrites the old work and adds scholia to his own work, and it's not described as the scholia. So there's an outside possibility that Basil made two against Eunomius's, one with this scholia and one without it. We really don't know at the end of the day. So just, again, food for thought, and I'm a student of this and not an expert on it, so I will shut up and listen to someone who's read the entirety of Alexakis on this and remembers what he was talking about.
Right. Now, what I'd like to do is go to the Latin side. In other words, the history of the Latin transmission of this passage or disputed passage.
Yes.
And to do that, we need to know somebody about somebody named Alexakis, who's now or became professor of, I believe, Byzantine philology at the University of Ioannina. Now, in the 80s, he was still a doctoral student, and he was assigned to do a dissertation on Codex Paracinus 1115, so 1115. And that, the abbreviation we'll try to use for that is P. So Codex P is Paracinus 1115. So it's Paracinus Codex Graecus 1115, 1115. So he studied this codex, did the dissertation. Now, we need to know about what's in this codex. So the codex is a vast compilation of patristic material, including multiple florilegia, possibly one or even two florilegia just on the Holy Spirit or procession of the Holy Spirit. There's a florilegium on icons, as like defense of iconodulia, different theological treatises, lots and lots of goodies.
And St. Agatha's letter, as we were talking about fairly recently.
I can't even remember how much stuff there is. I studied the book and everything. I can't even remember some of it. But yeah, there was a lot of stuff in there. Oh, and stuff from the Lateran Council.
649.
649, correct.
Yes.
So the first thing to note is that he discovered, if you look at the colophon as he did, it says that it was copied from a Roman manuscript. Now, there's a Roman archetype, Roman source or original, which was 517 years old. Now, Codex Paracinus dates from 1276. The Roman archetype for this manuscript, which has been lost. We have a lost Roman manuscript. It came from the papal library, according to the colophon. And Alexakis, using Byzantine dating, dates it to 774. So we have a Roman manuscript, which is the source for Codex Paracinus from the papal library. It was apparently a vast compilation of patristic material, florilegia, two florilegia on the Holy Spirit or the procession, one on icons, different treatises. Right? This lost Roman archetype, let's just call it Rome 774. Let's just call it that.
On screen.
Okay. This is a very big deal. Why is it a big deal? It's a big deal because it was also the source for two other manuscripts, one famous and one of them not so much. Mm-hmm. But the first one, which is not so much famous, is Liber de Fide Trinitatis, and the other one is St. Thomas Aquinas' Contra Erroris Graecorum, which is certainly famous and a household name for theologians. Mm. Okay, so in the course of his doctoral work and research and dissertation, Alexakis discovered that this lost Roman manuscript, this arsenal of patristic material, was the source or archetype for the Liber de Fide Trinitatis and Contra Erroris Graecorum. Now, how did he figure that out? Well, the way he figured it out is that Codex Paracenus, or P, and these other works, the Liber de Fide Trinitatis or Contra had certain patristic quotations that you don't find anywhere else. And they're showing that they have a common source. And that common source is this Rome 774 manuscript, our unofficial name for it.
Mm-hmm.
For example, let's take an example. So here we have a text attributed to St. John Chrysostom. The text is in none of the known works of St. John Chrysostom today, but it's in the manuscripts as coming from St. John Chrysostom. The text is, "This is my Son, who together with me sends the Holy Spirit from himself." In Latin, "Hic est filius meus, qui una mecum mittit ex se spiritum sanctum." That's in Liber de Fide Trinitatis 81. Liber de Fide Trinitatis is the source for St. Thomas Aquinas' Contra Erroris Graecorum. Codex Paracenus and Liber de Fide Trinitatis have in common 20 quotations according to Alexakis. In other words, they're showing a common source. So this Rome 774 lost manuscript, this great arsenal with the Florilegia and the New Florilegia and the Holy Spirit, one on Iconodulia and other material theological treatises, is the source for Liber de Fide Trinitatis and the Contra Erroris Graecorum. Now, Liber de Fide Trinitatis, what is that? It's a big deal. It's a very big deal. Liber de Fide Trinitatis was a treatise in defense of the coming union at the Council of Lyon. So it's written in the early 1260s by a bishop known as Nicholas of Contra, and he came from Durazzo, which I believe is in modern Albania. So he's from the Balkans. So he's in that region where it's sort of between the Romans and the Greeks at Constantinople. It used to be a Roman region, Illyricum, okay, but was taken over by the Greeks in the 8th century. So Nicholas of Catron wrote this treatise, Liber de Fide Trinitatis, a book regarding the faith in the Trinity. Trinitatis is genitive, but we're going to say book regarding the faith in the Trinity, not the faith of the Trinity. So Liber de Fide Trinitatis is a compilation of over 100 quotes or texts. Most of them are in defense of the Latin doctrine on the filioque. Then there's a small number of texts in defense of the papal authority, the other disputed doctrines between the Latins and Greeks, basically purgatory and the azymes, the azymes, unleavened bread controversy. Okay, but most of the patristics are about the filioque. Now, the scholars have figured out that the Liber de Fide Trinitatis was the source that St. Thomas Aquinas used for the Contra Erroris Graecorum. The way it worked out is that basically the Pope handed him a libellus and said, not in so many words, "Friar Thomas, we need your help. Can you please look at this and give us your opinion on the theology?" All right? St. Thomas Aquinas was no judge of the patristic. That's not what he was being asked to judge. Okay, he was taking it for granted on good faith that the patristics were fine, and that his judgment was as a theologian on the theology and the dogma aspects of this work. Okay? And the result of that was the Contra Erroris Graecorum. Okay? So, since the Liber de Fide Trinitatis is the source for Contra Erroris Graecorum, and it's printed that way in the modern edition. For example, what's known as the Leonine edition, the Opera Omnia, all works of St. Thomas Aquinas. Leonine edition means a work commissioned by Pope Leo XIII. In the Leonine edition of the works of St. Thomas Aquinas, the Liber de Fide Trinitatis is printed with the Contra Graecorum, and this is done in other editions. For example, I have an edition from the 50s in Latin from the rector of the Catholic University of Lille, what was his name? Monseigneur Palemon Glorieux, which gives the Liber de Fide Trinitatis and the Contra Graecorum. Now, we need to understand that this disputed text from St. Basil, the Contra Eunomium 3.1, the one we've been talking about, it was not copied onto Codex Paracenus. They rejected it. But it did make its way to the Latin side. So the Latin side is Liber de Fide Trinitatis, followed by Contra Graecorum. Can we get the flowcharts up, by the way?
It is up, but let me let you continue, and I'll have one critical question to ask, because it really would call into question Alexakis' thesis on this, but please unpack it.
Sure. Okay. The thing that I'm going to do here is, so this is a very big deal. We have this lost Roman manuscript with all these florilegia, this vast patristic arsenal, and
just to confirm for people today, which is preserved in Paracenus Gracchus 1115, because in that manuscript it says of itself, this is a copy of a manuscript that is dated 520 years ago about. So we do have this lost manuscript allegedly preserved intact thanks to Paracenus Gracchus 1115.
Okay. So now what I want to do is point out, first of all, this lost manuscript had the disputed text from Contra Eunomium that the Latins were supporting.
Now,
or at least its derivatives have the text.
So to confirm, Paracenus Gracchus 1115 in the Greek does not have it for whatever reason, and we can discuss why. But
they rejected it.
But Liber de Fide Trinitatis, which is a Latin translation of many of the passages in Paracenus Gracchus 1115, does have it. And so the argument is the version from 774 must have had it, because how else would it be preserved to have been found in Liber de Fide Trinitatis? Is that correct?
That's basically what Alexakis is saying, correct?
Yes.
So in other words, this lost Roman manuscript that was a big gun, big weapon with the patristic arsenal, was the source of this particular text. Now, and other funky patristic texts that are not found in the modern works of the fathers, like that one I just quoted from St. John Chrysostom.
Yes.
Okay, so we're looking at the passing on of the patristics on the Latin side. Keep something else in mind. Remember when Maximologia said that this disputed text is in 8th century manuscripts at best. Remember that?
At best, this is the one.
Yeah. He wasn't talking about this one. We're talking on the Latin side now.
Well, the Latin's from the 13th century.
Right. Maximologia was talking about Greek manuscripts.
I thought he was referring particularly to Alexakis' argument that there's a 8th century Greek version that could have had it, which is the sort of argument Alexakis is making, that Paracenus Gracchus, which is allegedly a faithful copy of an 8th century manuscript from Rome, may not have it. Well, it doesn't have it, but a Latin copy of the same alternative version of Paracenus Gracchus that existed in the 13th century must have had it. So therefore, it existed in the 8th century. That's what I thought Maximologia was referring to, was Alexakis' overall argument.
In his argument, I only see him talking about manuscripts on the Greek side. So, and they're specifically the manuscripts of Contra Eunomium. They're not like compilations that he's talking about.
Okay.
Okay?
Yeah.
This manuscript, the Rome 774, the lost one, is like a Florilegium manuscript. And this would be important enough if you were, if you're talking about the history of Florilegia, their use in the councils, all that side, Alexakis has a lot of the book devoted to that. So
Alexakis thinks that the version from Rome in the 8th century comes from a version of Rome from the 7th century in preparation for Lateran 649.
Right. So this is what Alexakis suspects as a possibility. Okay, so basically he produced an article in the Revue des Études Byzantines in 2000. I think it was something like Greek patristic testimonia in favor of the filioque at the Council of Florence reconsidered. I think the title was something like that.
Mm-hmm.
And he got into some of these issues, and he said that this disputed text of Contra Eunomium may date to the 7th century, because we know from the letter of St. Maximus to Marinus that the Romans were making Florilegia. Yes. They were making Florilegia to defend their doctrine on the Holy Spirit, in other words, the filioque. And he believes that the Greek monks were collaborating with the Latins, which indeed they were at the time of the Lateran Council, and that the result of this may have been this interpolation in the Contra Eunomium. That's his belief. Now, I've studied a lot of his writings very carefully to see if he has anything like evidence or proof.
It's just a hunch. Yeah.
And I honestly, to be honest, I don't see strict evidence. I don't see hard evidence.
His argument's that Maximus in the letter Marinus, one, makes reference to there being a Florilegium, and two, cites St. Cyril to the effect, and that citation Cyril is also found in Patristics 1115. And so then the argument is, therefore, because Patristics 1115 contains this citation for Cyril, and is a Florilegium, this must have been the same Florilegium that overall existed for the filioque, but then the parts of Iconodulia and the other stuff was added for whatever reasons they needed in the 8th century, right? So it's a tangential argument. Tangential gives a unnecessarily negative connotation, so it's possible that's the kind of argument that's being made.
Okay. So, like I say, Alexakis thought it was possible that maybe the Greek monks interpolated this passage to defend the Romans on the filioque. Now, that's not what I'm saying.
Yeah.
And I don't see proof of it.
Yeah.
But it was like sort of almost like a hunch that he had, or a hypothesis.
Yeah.
So, now, this is what I'm saying. Okay, this is the big picture here. So we have this one text, that's the famous one disputed, Contra Eunomium 3:1. But then there are these other disputed texts, or these texts that can't be located in the works of the fathers, like this St. John Chrysostom text that I just quoted.
Yeah.
Okay? Now, the texts come from this lost Roman archetype, the Rome 774 manuscript. From there, they go, like I have in the flowchart, they go to the Liber de Fide Trinitatis, and then into the Contra Errores Graecorum of St. Thomas Aquinas. So that's the flowchart. Mm-hmm. So now, that's what I mean by the transition, the transmission or handing on of the patristics on the Latin side. It's more than the one disputed passage from Contra Eunomium. There are multiple disputed passages. Now, how many? Mm-hmm. That's the last part I'm going to do now. Okay. This is my counts. Okay. So, I sat down with an edition of a Catholic edition of the Liber de Fide Trinitatis, Remember, that's the source for St. Thomas Aquinas in the Contra Gracorum. So I'm sitting down with Liber de Fide Trinitatis, published by Catholic University of Lille, by the rector, and I'm looking at the patristics. The editor is the rector of the university. He's got the notes on the patristics on the bottom in Latin. What do we got? Here's the count. Okay. 17. Locus ac opus incognita. In other words, neither the passage or the work are known. Neither one. That is, we don't know where this passage comes from. We don't know what work it's coming from. All right. So maybe quoting St. Cyril, Athanasius, Basil, whoever, 17 times. We don't know where the passage is from. We don't know what work it's from. In other words, they can't find it.
Yeah.
Okay, 17 of those. 14 citations ad mentem. I don't know what ad mentem means. You're quoting what they meant. Yeah. So, like if you say, tell your mom Craig says hi, and I say, Mom, Craig says hey. That's a citation ad mentem, I guess.
There you go.
So, citing what they meant. Okay. 14 citations ad mentem. Six citations from Contra Eunomium, Book 5, which is universally considered spurious.
Yeah.
6 citations like that. Contra Eunomium 5, considered spurious. 1 spurious for St. John Chrysostom. 6, that's according to the editor. 6 citations are, by the editor's judgment, interpolated. 9 are fore ad verb, in other words, almost word for word. 1 from St. Cyril, locus incognitus, passage can't be found. In other words, we don't know where it's from. Passage can't be found. 1 like that from St. Chrysostom, 1 like that from St. Gregory the Great on the Azymes. 11 passages from St. Cyril. Oh, wait, I'm sorry. That's okay. So strike the last from St. Cyril. Okay. Then we have at least 2 or 3, at least 2 inexact or inaccurate citations of the Council of Chalcedon, giving, appeal rights to the Pope and exaggerated honorifics, that kind of thing. I read the passages I found were questionable. And you know that I've studied the Acts of Chalcedon.
Yes.
Okay. So that's it. That's my count on the accuracy of the patristics in Liber de Fide Trinitatis, which is what Aquinas was using for the Contra Gracorum.
So let me say something critical here. I think we're talking about big matzo balls, right? So the Greeks had a pretty big matzo ball during Florence because they had the minority of manuscripts on this question, right? The Contra Eunomius, which had the interpolated section, which I'm going to put on screen in bold so people see it. They came out on top. But I think Alexakis has an awfully big matzo ball in his argument. And this is why, again, I will cite it. I did the same thing with the St. Agatho stuff, where we depend on him. It's the best evidence we have, but there is a big matzo ball, and I want to bring this out, which is Patristics Gracchus 1115 just does not have this passage. And this would mean if Patristics Gracchus 1115, or P, is an accurate rendering of what this older manuscript from the 8th century in Rome was, then this would be 8th century evidence of this manuscript not having the passage. Which is interesting because it would also be 8th century evidence, for example, of St. Agatho's letter in the Greek, doesn't mean Latin, not having a particular passage in it, and on we go. There's more to Alexakis' argument, by the way. He does think there are certain things added during the 9th century, but we're going to leave that aside for now. To connect that, because the book on the faith on the Holy Trinity in the 13th century had this passage, that then necessarily the 8th century version had the passage, to me is a supposition which is possible but not immediately proven. It would show that either, and I'm going to put both back, I'll put the flow chart back on the screen, it would show that the lost Roman manuscript either more accurately matched what we have in Latin translation in Liber Dei Fidei Trinitatis, or whatever Liber Dei Fidei Trinitatis used, it was not in its entirety what's actually found in the 8th century manuscript. Essentially, Alexakis has to presume that what Liber Dei Fidei Trinitatis has corrects what was somehow left out in the version of Paracensus Graecus 1115. Now, there's a big problem with this, I think. Paracensus Graecus 1115, as far as we know, was prepared for John Bekos. Right? Like that's why it was put together, supposedly from this Roman manuscript. It was made for John Bekos. Now, that being the case, we know that John Bekos had no motive to remove the interpolated version of Against Eunomius, because, as you point out, he used as his first argument in one of his books the interpolated version of Against Eunomius. So this would actually be evidence that the copy from Rome that they did use actually didn't have it, which I think invades against Alexakis' supposition. However, this would not prove that the version that Liber Dei Fidei Trinitatis uses was somehow added by them, because we have proof, like, and I'm going to put it on screen, as you point out from the Maxima Logia, pointing from the critical edition, that there's a whole family of manuscripts that have this beginning in the 9th century. So it's not that they would have had to reverse engineer and add it into something almost as old as the lost Roman manuscript, because it did exist in the early 9th century, in manuscripts that still exist today. This perhaps opens the possibility that we have textual variants of the lost Roman manuscript, one that made it to Constantinople when Paracensus Graecus 115 was made, and one that that didn't make it, and one that did make it to another Greek version, which was then translated and used by Liber Dei Fidei Trinitatis. The fact that this version was amended during the 9th century by Alexakis' admission, interestingly, and I think he actually says that the last person to stop making changes to it was Anastasius the librarian, does point to that if I had to just guess which version had it and which didn't, it would make sense that it would have been the 9th century version, because that's when we have 9th century Greek manuscripts with this version in it. But anyway, these are my guesses. It just, at the end of the day, the version that we have of Paracensus Graecus doesn't have it, and a Latin translation of the source material that is also found at Paracensus Graecus does have it. And this gives us good confidence that at least in the 9th century, this passage existed. I think to argue it goes back to the 7th century on that evidence alone is insufficient. My opinion, and then I'll give you the last word on this because you're the guy who did the research, and then we'll do audience questions. My opinion is this is either original to Basil to Ascolia, because we do have enough 9th century manuscript, or it exists as a pretty early scholia from the scribe. I don't think, I put on screen, I don't think it was invented by Anastasius, because he would have had no motivation, Anastasius, to actually unpack Eunomius and put an aside about this is Eunomius' opinions and rebut Eunomius' opinions. That doesn't make sense. It does make sense that Anastasius would have been aware of the passage from other Greek manuscripts and then corrected Paracensus Gracchus, in fact, quite innocently, in my opinion. There have been nothing nefarious about it. But anyway, so that's my view. I think it's earlier than Maximus, personally. I don't think it could even be original from Basil as a scholia. So those are my opinions, but I don't think it was in the lost Roman manuscript. I think a corrected version of the Roman manuscript adds this scholia into it. So that's my view, and I'll let myself be corrected by someone who has studied this more carefully. So John, how about you give the summary and your final words on your view of what occurred?
What I'd like to do here is give what I consider a hostage video of the Latin Church's greatest theologian.
Got it.
That would be St. Thomas Aquinas.
Yes.
What is a hostage video? Well, St. Thomas Aquinas was given, he's commenting on this passage of St. Basil, which he believes authentic. Okay, because it's part of the Liber Definitor. But the Pope has asked him to comment on. Okay? Now, the mode in scholasticism is you don't come out and say, oh, St. Basil doesn't know what he's talking about. You can't do that.
Even if you think it, you don't say. Right?
You know how it works.
Right? Because you remember the beginning of Against Greek Errors. Thomas Aquinas says that the fathers say things that sound like they're contradicting what we later believe, but they had a different way of saying things at that time. Right? So he's conceptually saying they're saying the same thing.
The rule is that if you possibly can, you try to find some orthodox interpretation.
Yes, absolutely. That's what Aquinas is saying.
Even if you're not crazy about what it says, you try to find some pious orthodox interpretation. So here's what St. Thomas Aquinas says in Contra Gracorum Pars Prior, first part, chapter 2. This is just a snippet. As for what Basil says about the Spirit being second in dignity from the Son, that seems to have the greater injuriousness. In Latin, maiore habere calumnia. That seems to have the greater calumny, literally.
That sounds wrong. It sounds wrong.
Yeah. Seems to have the greater calumny because it seems to constitute a rank in the dignity of the Trinity, whereas the dignity of the three persons is equal and the same. Okay, then he goes on to say, now it can be explained not regarding natural but personal dignity, according to which mode Hilary says that the Father is greater than the Son because of the authority of origin. The Son, however, is not less than the Father because of the unity of substance. In other words, that's a hostage video. He's under duress, and the duress is that he's given this passage which he's led to believe is authentic from St. Basil, about the stuff about the second in the dignity and all of that, whatever it is, the third in dignity, all that. And he's trying to find some kind of orthodox, some kind of pious interpretation. He starts out saying, as for what Basil says that the Spirit is second in dignity from the Son, it seems to have the greater calumny because it seems to constitute a rank in the dignity of the Trinity. But it does. Okay?
That's his point.
I know of none of the, see, the Thomists, what they do is they follow the St. Thomas, the commentaries. You're not going to get a typical man-eating Thomist who's going to say what I did. Hey, here's a hostage video situation. They've got St. Thomas with a gun to his head with this passage that, they told him is, or he's led to believe is legitimate from St. Basil. The Pope asked him to comment on it, and there's stuff about second or third in dignity in the Trinity. He has to come up with, he's kind of like, has to come up with some orthodox explanation, like a bank teller who's just had a gun pointed in his face saying, give me all your money or you're dead. Okay, that's a hostage video. All right, so I just wanted to conclude with that, to show that, I understand that doctrines don't change, dogmas don't change, eternal truths don't change. Essences as they are in the mind of God don't change. But sometimes you have to keep up with the scholarship or it's going to lead to problems. All right? Now, I've mocked the scholars many, many times when the scholarship is not evidence-based.
Yes.
But you still have to keep up with the scholarship that is evidence-based. You notice in this stream, I made a clear distinction between fact, between what's proven, between what's probable, likely, as opposed to mere opinion. I've always made that distinction throughout this entire stream. What's strictly the evidence versus what's probable versus what's merely opinion. Okay? Now, there's one question. Somebody asked me, somebody in a conversation asked me this question. Well, what if it looks like you're undercutting our own side here with this stream? I said, well, I'll compare it to a play in football. You know that play where you're an offensive lineman and your quarterback throws a bad pass, it's been batted into the air, and it's about to be intercepted? You can't catch the pass because it's a penalty. You're not an eligible receiver, so you bat it down.
Yeah.
Okay, and that's considered a good play. Well, if somebody on my side throws a bad pass, in other words, makes a bad argument, and it's about to be intercepted, or likely to be, then I have to bat it down. Okay, and then I'm making a good play. All right, so that was my answer when I asked, what if I'm undercutting our side? Of course, I'm not undercutting my side. All right, so I'm actually releasing, in my opinion, I'm releasing St. Thomas from the hostage video. And the only way the only way that this passage can be authentic is if St. Basil quoted Eunomius in 2 phrases without attribution, and then added 2 more phrases that are supporting the filioque. That's the only way this is authentic. So keep that in mind. Okay, so...
Or Eunomius said more things that were pro the filioque, or the way he understood what Basil said was something sounding conceptually like the filioque. Right? So he could have just gone by memory something Eunomius had said.
I'm just going to tell you something, Craig. I'm an old guy here, okay?
I don't need
subscriptions or any of that. I see a lot of people out there that aspire to be apologists. Right? The problem is that it's not that they're stupid. That's not really the problem. A lot of these guys are very smart. Okay? But smart people, as we see in this stream, very smart and legendary people can make mistakes. Or be put into that hostage video situation. All right? And the one thing that does make me cringe, which I see a lot, I see folks on one side or the other side making a bad argument, and then other folks come in and comments with these cheerleading comments for the bad argument.
Yeah.
That is when I cringe. And that is what I'm trying to warn against by doing this video.
I see.
Okay,
so you feel this is like damage control for what could be something that would lead to the other side intercepting the ball and running with it. You don't want that. You want another play.
Well, the point is that apologetics are truth.
Yes.
Okay? The first rule in apologetics is you tell the truth, whatever it is. Tell the truth. All right? And that's really what I'm doing in this video before it's any sort of damage or anything like that. First thing is that I want people to tell the truth. All right? And sometimes that takes a lot more work and more research than it does to just let fly with whatever argument comes to mind.
Well, it takes less time. Is simply just making fun of the other person. Just find some alleged moral foible and capitalize on that.
Okay, so with If you have a few questions, I can take some quick questions, possibly.
Buke, we got 3, and we'll leave it there. We have this. What's John's view on the comma Johannium? So 1 John 5.
Oh, I have no opinion whatsoever. Whatever the standard scholarship holds, it's probably, what I've heard is that it's probably not authentic, more likely not authentic, but I know nothing else about it.
My opinion is it is authentic. It's quoted by St. Cyprian, who's earlier than the manuscripts that lack it. And then the manuscripts that lack it are only about 2 or 3 decades older than a comment by St. Ambrose, who says there's Arians that are removing this passage in our time. Which,
okay.
So to me, it's like, all right, like you have someone there during the time of the crime telling you this is a crime that's occurring, and then you have a witness to something's existence before the crime ever occurred. So I am in favor of its authenticity. So there we go. That's that question. We have also a question for John. What is your favorite Sonic the Hedgehog game?
I have no idea.
I mean, did you even play any video games in the 80s?
I don't.
Yeah, so John never got into that. As for me, I suppose it'd be Sonic the Hedgehog 3. When I was a kid, I'd go to Sears because I didn't have a Sega Genesis. So I'd go to Sears and play it. So there you go. I'm old enough to remember Sears being a real thing. So we have Adrian Wyatt. Anastasius Librarian strikes again? So, John, so I would say you would disagree. You would say that the passage against Eunomius with the interpolation did exist in the Lost Roman manuscript, right? You would agree with Alexakis.
Okay, that's the view, again, like I say, we always distinguish here between facts, what's proven, what's likely, etc. Okay, we make that distinction. So what do we got here? Well, what Alexakis is saying is that from the Lost Roman archetype, from the 700s, from 774, you have texts coming into the derivative manuscripts, Codex Paracenus or Liber de Fide Trinitatis, whatever, that you don't find somewhere else. And that's how you know. So you either accept that as a proof or you don't. So depending on that, what level of proof you give to that, he's saying that because of the derivation, in other words, because you find it in the derivatives, in Contra Grecorum and Liber de Fide Trinitatis, it's coming from a Roman archetype in 774. Now, that's either proof or it's likely or whatever, but I would certainly say, deferring to Alexakis, it is likely that this text existed before Anastasius the Librarian. Probably in that 74 manuscript, probably older, but we don't have to make it proven. We don't have to say it's proven. We can just give it the philological force that it has from its derivation from that source, from the Rome 774. I mean, either Alexakis is right or he's wrong. So I would say more likely he's right.
And my view is it certainly existed in the 9th century, mere decades after the 774. But I believe that Alexakis has improved this point. We do know from Paracenus Gracchus 1115 that we have an attestation that the Lost Roman manuscript did not have it because Paracenus Gracchus 1115, as a matter of fact, does not have the passage. And so the question is, how did the Latin version, which is a translation of the different Greek version of Paracenus Gracchus 1115, so to say, how do they have the passage? And being that Alexakis, I think, does at least show a good probability that there were additions and adjustments made in the 9th century, we probably have an alternate version of the Roman manuscript from 774, but from the late 800s. We know that Anastasius Librarian was one of the last people to make some adjustments, but Alexakis says it could be some people after him, so I'm not going to say it could be Zacharias Habani or someone after Anastasius. But be that as it may, if you just look at if it was already existing that early, and we have manuscripts outside of this that had it, which are from the 9th and 10th centuries, And if you look at the nature of the interpolation, right, it's quoting Eunomius at parts, and otherwise the parts that aren't quoting Eunomius seem to be giving conceptual paraphrases of what those things must mean. Being that Eunomius was a dead letter by the 8th, 9th, even 7th centuries, when Maximus was coming up with the Florilegium, this to me points to a scholia or alternate version that either from Basil himself or from a scribe after Basil that had this passage. So I feel very strongly that the eternal evidence points to before the lost Roman archetype, but that the lost Roman archetype does not have it. So that's my view on this question. I just don't think Alexakis connects the dots adequately, though he does a lot of really great work on this question. So that's my view. So ironically, my view comes closer to vindicating Wagner than John's view. But be that as it may, John is giving the mainstream view. And we have, I don't know what this is. Elliot says, because we got a little old convoy rocking through the night. Yeah, we got a little old convoy. Ain't she a beautiful sight? I think this is The Simpsons. I think it's this reference to...
Yeah, that's a song. That's a song from the 70s, Convoy.
Oh, okay.
Beloved to truckers everywhere.
Oh, okay. So the
novelty song from the 70s.
Oh, so they're saying you sound like a trucker because you're calling in on your CB radio.
These truckers that are being harassed by Smokies, presumably the state.
Oh, it's Smokey and the Band. Is that what this is from?
Right, but what they're going to do is they're just going to run right through the cops at 100 miles an hour. So that's like the chorus of the song. We got a great, what is it? We got a great big convoy trucking through the night. We got a great big convoy, beautiful sight. Come on and join our convoy. There ain't nothing going to get in our way. We got a mighty convoy across the USA. Something like that. I love that song.
So you know what, John? I don't think we can top that. So yeah, we'll leave it with there. John, how about I give you an opportunity, any sort of plugs for anything you just want the audience to be aware of?
Oh, okay. By the way, I did notice Shining Diamond in the chat says I support the Nicene Arabic canons. No, what I support is the factuality of the history. So, Arabic canons of Nicaea means I'm saying the canons are Nicene, which I'm not.
Yes.
What I'm saying is those canons are found in Syriac in multiple nomocanons of the Syriac churches, and they go back, for example, Gabriel of Basra, Elias of Damascus. Then there's a mention of them in the letters of...
But to make along, they go back to the 5th century, your argument is. I forget the saint's name. He's one of the attendees of Constantinople I. And he helped make a canon law for the East Syrian church.
They're attributed in Chaldean tradition and manuscripts to Saint Maruthas of Mifracot, who is in the early 5th century.
Yeah.
So it's not that I'm supporting the canons. What I'm saying is this is what the Chaldean tradition says about them. Here are the churches in which those canons are received. Here are the nomocanons in which those canons, in which the two canons, or rather, whether it's 73 or 84 or 80, here are the nomocanons in which they are to be found. Ethiopian, Coptic, mostly East Syrian, some West Syrian, etc., etc., etc. So I'm supporting the factuality of the story and documenting all of that. That's completely different from supporting spurious canons. Two completely different things.
And that they originate from a saint and they were canon law for a non-schismatic church for a period of time, right? Then they're meaningful. So I would agree with you. It's not something where you can just dispense with it and say, I don't like what it says. In fact, wasn't there a Coptic translation of these canons? And the scholar even says, we don't agree. We don't agree with what it says here, but this is what it says. If I remember right. So yeah, it's too easily dispensed with as, no, it's not really saying this, but it is saying what it says.
we have a fellow saying the song is from the movie Convoy. No, the song is older than the movie Convoy.
They're just singing the song.
and this was much loved in the 70s because these were truckers, So truckers they stand for freedom, hard work, work ethic, self-reliance. Whereas, the Smokies, they stand for, well, not necessarily the Bilderberg workers, but this overarching, overbearing government, So in the 70s, where the problems weren't, a fraction of what they are today, the convoys basically, they're like the good guys standing for liberty, even if they are blowing through the law at 100 miles an hour.
Yeah, the convoy stands for all of us, all of the people. Now I've got this question: why is my stream with Caleb keep getting pushed back? I'm going to wait to do that stream until the minutes of Council of 4 come out with the footnotes of Dositheus, because I'd like to talk with them with Caleb. So it will be pushed back until Orthodox Uncut Madden Press makes the final version. I have the preliminary version of the minutes, but until they make the final version of the minutes of that council in 879, 880. As for my plugs, as always, support the mission work in Cambodia, orthodoxchristiantheology.com/donate. If this has blessed you, please, $5, whatever, help the church in Cambodia, help the evangelism work there. So that's, as always, my plug. Well, John, it's been really great having this conversation. I think it's the most detailed conversation on this topic on the internet. And so I'm really grateful for you doing this, because quite frankly, I think a few years ago I read Alexakis' dissertation and pretty much forgot everything. Because sometimes I read stuff and I'm not, an apologist brain. So I'm not knowing, I'm going to need to know this one day because it's going to become some sort of controversy on the internet. I think you did a real good job getting to everything into even more detail than when Alexakis did. And it's always great. I like your volume and sound. It's like a radio call-in. I really appreciate whenever you do call-in. And so, thanks again.
Okay, well, do I get to do the plugs?
Oh, yeah. I thought your plug was the bash. Starting time. And by all means, please do your plugs.
Okay, so first of all, my plug today is, I hope I'll be allowed to say this, I presume I will, but in my opinion, there is a genocide in progress in Palestine and Gaza. I ask for prayers for the victims of genocide, prayers for their temporal and also eternal salvation. I hope I'm allowed to say, pray for the conversion of the Jews. Now that would be an interesting subject for a stream, Zionism. And what is church, what does patristic tradition have to say about Zionism? That would be a very interesting stream. Of course, we could get thrown off the internet, I don't want to do that to anybody.
You could do that with truth be told.
That's the first plug. That would be my first. I've asked for those prayers. I have one more, which has occurred to me.
Go ahead.
Okay, so, people, try to email me or message me saying, Mr. Collorafi, do you want to come on our stream? You want to come on our channel? There is something I'd be willing to do, which is I did with a friend of mine on a kind of small internet radio, the history of what's called military filibusters. Now, filibuster is the story of American aggression against Catholics. All right? Now, a filibuster is a private war. All right? That's in 19th century usage, not today, of course. But the revolution in Texas, under Sam Houston, was in part a military filibuster supported by at least one Masonic lodge, actually more than that. And the result of that was that whereas Mexico before that had been entirely Catholic, even under Santa Anna, who had some problems, he was allegedly a member of Freemasonry. But Mexico had been basically Catholic until up to Santa Anna's time. And the result of the filibuster was that Texas was turned over to the secret societies, to the Freemasonic slave-owning and slave-trading element. And just as an example, if you look at, I've seen, I don't know, like at least 4 movies about the Alamo, they're always the heroes. Well, one of the things I brought out in the series that Jim Bowie, Jim Bowie, the big hero with the famous knife and the hot temper, Bowie was a slave trader. And he was a partner of somebody named Jean Lafitte, a pirate. And well, I looked up, if you look up Lafitte's ancestry in his journal, which may be authentic, let's just say it's not Irish Catholic or French Creole. It's something else. It's not Christian. All right, so the result of this filibuster was other filibusters against Latin America, Mexico, Central America, Cuba, etc. And the result was the attempted expansion of the slave power, and these filibusters were done in conjunction with Masonry. This is not well known, but if you look, as I say, there is an somewhat accurate article in just the Wikipedia entry is military filibuster, or filibusters military, and also an article somewhere on the internet, Freemasons and filibusters, the secret obligation. Now, I did my own research for this, but from stuff I see on the internet and from what I see among traditional Catholics and folks on your side, this would be something that they should know about, because we're talking about the secret societies and their history in this country, in America, not in the abstract. It's not the Rothschilds in the abstract or the, Freemasons in the abstract, but as part of the real history of our country, which has been then glorified by Hollywood and then handed down under patriotic myths and so forth. Heroes of the Alamo. Oh, how many times I saw the John Wayne and other movies. So, yes, Texas fell under the power of the secret societies, which then resulted in further filibusters to expand the slave power. And if you go and look at who was behind the importation of slavery in this country, it wasn't necessarily, wasn't necessarily Christians in every case. Just put it that way. Okay, this is something I'd like to be better known. It's definitely worth the stream. I did a whole series with a friend of mine. So those articles are worth checking out. Freemasons and filibusters, the secret obligation.
And where can people find the series?
Well, I did it with a friend of mine on something called Liberty Works Radio Network. It was called the, what was it? I wasn't planning on giving out the email. I have to.
Well, they could Google it, though, right? They could find Liberty Works and do that.
Let me see. The militia. My friend uses the email. The militia guy at. Oh, I have to remember the email. I think it's the militia guy at hotmail.com. But basically, Liberty Works Radio Network, which has its own site, and then the program was Christian Revolt Long Overdue. And if you contact the network and that particular program, Christian Revolt Long Overdue, or also my host is on Facebook, so you can go to his Facebook, Nick Landholt, on Facebook, Landholt. He's on Facebook. If there's a different name, his avatar is the image of Christ the King, so you can tell it's him. And you can go and just message him on Facebook for the series, Filibuster, The Secret History of American-Led Aggression. Okay, so it's worth, this is, I see a lot of people trying to rehabilitate the slave power without understanding the secret societies and who else was behind it. And the young folks in particular need to have this knowledge, in my opinion. So if you're interested in that, that's where you go. Nick Landholt on Facebook, Christian Revolt Long Overdue, also on Facebook, and he'll send you the funds.
There you go. So some good underground radio stuff going on with John. Well, John, again, thanks as always. It's been great having you on. And we're going to say thank you so much.
You betcha.
All right, I will end this show, as I end all of them, by quoting Jesus Rock, fight to death for the truth, and the Lord God will fight for you. God bless you. Have a great day.